And sometimes the revelations that hit hardest aren't scandals or headlines. They're the soft, unflinching confessions that quietly rearrange everything you thought you knew. It wasn't a fiery outburst or a tabloid exposé. It was gentler, and in many ways heavier, than that. When Sally Field spoke publicly about Burt Reynolds after his death, her words carried an emotional gravity that caught a lot of people off guard, especially those who had spent years idealizing their romance as one of Hollywood's golden love stories. There was no anger in her voice. No bitterness. Just clear-eyed honesty, and that honesty wasn't polished or glamorous. For a long time, the public image of Sally Field and Burt Reynolds was preserved in amber, laughing on red carpets, crackling with chemistry in Smokey and the Bandit, the dazzling couple of the late 1970s. Fans. They looked magnetic, effortless, perfectly in sync. But real relationships rarely matched their movie posters. In interviews and especially in her memoir In Pieces, Field revealed a far more layered reality. She acknowledged that their love had been intense, consuming, and at times deeply beautiful, but also wounding in ways that left lasting marks. She admitted that by the final stretch of their relationship, and even years afterward, she could no longer be in his presence in a way that felt safe or healthy for her. That one admission quietly shifted the entire legacy they shared, not because it exposed some explosive secret, but because it exposed raw human vulnerability. She described still loving certain parts of him, still missing pieces of what they had been, and yet needing real distance to safeguard her own well-being. That kind of candor is difficult, especially when the person you're speaking about is no longer alive to offer his side. Her tone wasn't accusatory. It was thoughtful, careful, almost as though she had spent decades carefully sorting through what that chapter had truly meant to her. This wasn't an attempt to tear down a Hollywood legend. It was an effort to reclaim her own story, and when she said she couldn't be near him toward the end, it wasn't cruelty. It was self-preservation, because sometimes the relationships that feel the most intoxicating are also the ones that quietly drain you the most, and sometimes genuine love, even the deepest kind, isn't enough to make staying safe. When Sally Field and Burt Reynolds first met, it played out like something scripted for the screen. They were cast opposite each other in Smokey and the Bandit, a movie that would become an instant cultural touchstone. On camera their chemistry was electric, playful, flirtatious, impossible to look away from. Off camera that spark didn't fade when the director called cut. At the time Burt Reynolds was one of the biggest movie stars on the planet. He had a charisma that commanded rooms, a swagger that defined a whole era of Hollywood masculinity. He wasn't merely popular, he was dominant. Box office records, magazine covers, widespread public adoration. Sally Field was on a sharp upward trajectory of her own. But her path carried a different energy. She had already fought hard to move beyond early television roles and be taken seriously as an actress. She was deliberately building depth, working toward the dramatic performances that would later earn her 2 Academy Awards. When they came together, the public saw glamour. What the public didn't see was the imbalance. Field later reflected on how intoxicating Reynolds' presence could be. He was charming, protective, larger than life, but being close to someone that powerful, that universally adored, can subtly reshape your own sense of self. At first it felt romantic. Being chosen by someone so magnetic can feel deeply affirming, but as the spotlight grew brighter, so did the unspoken expectations. Publicly they were a golden couple. Privately the relationship carried an emotional intensity that wasn't always gentle. Their love wasn't fake. It was real, and that's exactly why it carried so much weight, because when something begins with real fire, it often burns hotter, and more unpredictably, than either person anticipates, and sometimes the very qualities that make someone irresistible in the beginning become overwhelming later on. That shift rarely happens in one dramatic moment. It happens slowly, quietly, and in the beginning, almost no one can see what that intensity will eventually demand. Burt Reynolds was at the absolute peak of his superstardom during their relationship. He commanded attention without effort. Studios built entire films around him. Interviewers treated him like royalty. He was the living embodiment of late 1970s masculine confidence in Hollywood. Sally Field loved parts of that strength, but she later acknowledged that it often came wrapped in control. In her memoir she described feeling emotionally pulled in directions that weren't always healthy for her. Reynolds could be warm and supportive, but he could also be jealous, possessive, and unpredictable. Loving someone larger than life frequently means living inside their orbit. Field later admitted she lost pieces of herself while trying to keep the relationship intact, not because she lacked strength, but because emotional gravity is a real force. When one partner dominates the public narrative, the other can begin to shrink in ways that aren't immediately obvious. She wasn't simply dating a movie star. She was dating an icon, and icons are rarely skilled at sharing space. Field described moments when she felt diminished. Moments when she struggled to voice her own needs. Moments when the sheer intensity of the relationship felt more consuming than comforting, yet she stayed, for years. That's the part many people overlook. She stayed because she loved him, because relationships built on real passion don't unravel cleanly or quickly. They tangle. They twist. They create memories that are almost impossible to release, but emotional imbalance doesn't vanish just because love is present. It grows. And eventually it insists on being seen. For Sally Field, that moment of recognition came at a steep personal cost. Decades later in Pieces, Sally Field didn't sensationalize her history with Burt Reynolds. She clarified it. She described him as someone she had loved deeply, but also as someone who wasn't always safe for her emotionally. She acknowledged that parts of their relationship had been painful, that there were times she felt controlled, that the emotional volatility eventually became exhausting. One of the most striking things she said was explaining why she chose not to reconnect with him in his later years. She said she simply couldn't be around him, not out of hatred, but because proximity reopened wounds she had worked hard to close. That single statement carried enormous emotional weight. For fans who had long idealized their love story, it felt jarring, but for Field, it was about boundaries. It was about recognizing what she could, and could no longer, revisit without hurting herself. She didn't erase the love. She didn't rewrite their shared history. She simply made room for the truth that some relationships leave scars right alongside the memories, and sometimes protecting your own peace means keeping distance, even from someone you once loved with everything you had. Her honesty wasn't cruel. It was thoughtful. She understood that nostalgia can blur hard truths. That time can soften sharp edges in memory, but she refused to romanticize what had also wounded her. That refusal is what gave her words such gravity. She wasn't trying to destroy Burt Reynolds' legacy. She was trying to reclaim her own story, and sometimes the most powerful revelations aren't loud explosions. They're quiet admissions of what it really felt like to live through something. Leaving someone you love is almost never simple or tidy. It isn't one explosive fight or one unforgivable betrayal. It's usually a slow accumulation, a gradual understanding that love alone isn't fixing the deeper imbalance. For Sally Field, walking away from Burt Reynolds wasn't triggered by a single dramatic event. It was exhaustion. Emotional wear. The quiet realization that she could no longer keep diminishing herself to preserve the relationship. In her memoir she reflects on how deeply she loved him, and how deeply entangled she became. That kind of bond doesn't break easily. It keeps pulling you back. It convinces you that the intensity must mean destiny, but intensity can also blur boundaries. Field later described how difficult it became to assert her own independence inside the relationship. Reynolds' personality was dominant, charismatic, confident, accustomed to being in control, not only in his career but in his personal life as well. For a time she adapted, but adaptation has limits. She was building her own career, pushing for serious dramatic roles, earning respect in Hollywood on her own terms. That growth required emotional and professional breathing room. eventually she understood that staying would mean compromising more than she could afford to give. Walking away didn't erase the love. It fractured it. Reynolds reportedly believed she would eventually come back. He later said publicly that losing her was one of the greatest regrets of his life, but regret, even when sincere, doesn't repair what's already been broken, and sometimes leaving isn't about anger. It's about survival. Years after their breakup, Burt Reynolds spoke openly about Sally Field in interviews. He called her the love of his life. He admitted he had mishandled parts of their relationship in a strange way. It created emotional symmetry. Field had already done the long internal work of processing the pain. Reynolds was only beginning to publicly acknowledge his own role in it. There's something tragic about that timing, when two people experience the same relationship so differently, one feeling overwhelmed while the other remains unaware of the damage until much later. Understanding often arrives too late. Reynolds' regret appeared genuine. He didn't deflect blame. He didn't make excuses. He accepted responsibility in interviews, describing how much he missed her and how differently he wished he had behaved. But apologies, even heartfelt ones, don't rewrite emotional history. Field had already moved forward. She had built a career defined by independence and artistic strength. She had won 2 Academy Awards. She had established herself as a serious actress on her own terms, and perhaps most importantly, she had rebuilt her sense of self outside of his shadow. When Reynolds passed away, many expected a public narrative of reconciliation or softened memory. Instead, they received honesty, not anger, not cruelty, but clarity. And clarity in retrospect can feel heavier than any tidy reconciliation ever could. One of the most discussed parts of Sally Field's reflection was her straightforward admission that she had not been in contact with Burt Reynolds in the years leading up to his death. She said she simply couldn't be around him. That statement wasn't theatrical. It was calm and matter-of-fact, but it unsettled many people, because the culture prefers redemptive endings. We like stories in which former lovers reunite before the final curtain, where closure arrives in hospital rooms, where forgiveness is mutual and publicly visible. Real life is usually less cinematic. Field explained that being near Reynolds reopened emotional wounds she had spent years working to heal. It stirred currents that time had not fully resolved. That kind of honesty challenges comfortable nostalgia. It forces acknowledgement that some relationships leave permanent impressions, both beautiful and painful. Choosing distance wasn't punishment. It was protection. Field understood that any public reconciliation, for the sake of satisfying an audience, would not erase the underlying complexity of what they had shared, and complexity is rarely easy to witness. She didn't deny that she had loved him. She didn't dismiss the importance of their shared history. She simply acknowledged that loving someone deeply does not obligate you to reopen doors that once caused serious harm. That truth carries real weight because it speaks to growth, to boundaries, to self-preservation. And sometimes the most courageous act in a love story isn't holding on, it's walking away when you know staying will keep hurting you. After Burt Reynolds' death, the public wanted nostalgia. They wanted stories of on-set laughter, playful red carpet moments, the undeniable electricity of Smokey and the Bandit, and Sally Field gave some of that. She never denied the spark. She never erased the joy, but memory is layered. When she spoke about him later in life, she didn't look through rose-colored lenses. She looked through the perspective of someone who had done the hard internal work, therapy, reflection, writing, and understood that love can coexist with pain. She acknowledged that Reynolds had been profoundly important to her. He was part of her becoming, part of her growth, part of her story, but she also acknowledged the emotional toll. That balance is difficult for many to accept. We prefer simple narratives. Either a love story was magical or it was toxic. Either someone was the villain or the hero. Field refused that simplification. She made space for complexity. She described a relationship that was passionate and intense, at times overwhelming. She admitted she had lost pieces of herself while trying to sustain it, but she also admitted that he had made her laugh in ways very few people ever could. Memory doesn't erase harm, and harm doesn't erase love. That's what makes her words so serious. She wasn't trying to rewrite history. She was trying to hold all of it at once, and holding all of it, the joy, the regret, the distance, is far more difficult than pretending it was only one thing or the other. When Sally Field spoke candidly about Burt Reynolds, the reactions were immediate and deeply divided. Some praised her courage and honesty. They respected her refusal to romanticize a relationship that had been complicated and costly. They understood that loving someone deeply doesn't mean ignoring what it ultimately cost you. Others felt uncomfortable. For decades, Field and Reynolds had been framed as one of Hollywood's great romances. Photos of them laughing together had become part of pop culture mythology. Hearing that it hadn't been simple challenged that mythology, but mythology isn't memory. Hollywood thrives on polished narratives. Real relationships rarely follow clean script structure. The discomfort many felt revealed something larger. We don't always know how to respond when women speak honestly about powerful men they once loved. Field didn't accuse Reynolds of crimes. She didn't launch personal attacks. She described emotional imbalance and personal pain, and that alone was enough to unsettle people who preferred the fantasy version. The truth is that nostalgia often protects icons. Personal truth protects healing. Field's willingness to tell her version, even when it disrupted a beloved love story, wasn't done for drama. It was rooted in ownership of her experience, ownership of her boundaries, and sometimes that kind of ownership makes audiences uneasy, because it removes the fairy tale. But fairy tales are rarely the complete story. In the end, Sally Field didn't speak out to shock anyone. She spoke to tell the truth. Her reflections on Burt Reynolds weren't about revenge. They weren't about tarnishing his legacy. They were about acknowledging that something can be both profoundly meaningful and genuinely painful at the same time. That duality is what makes her words so serious. She loved him. She was hurt by him. She grew because of him. She left him to protect herself. All of those statements can be true simultaneously. The tragedy isn't that their relationship ended. The tragedy is that understanding arrived on different timelines for each of them. Reynolds publicly expressed regret late in life. Field had already moved forward. Their emotional timelines no longer aligned, and sometimes that misalignment becomes permanent. Her honesty reframes their story, not as scandal, but as complexity, not as villain versus victim, but as two flawed human beings navigating fame, ego, vulnerability, and love under an unrelenting spotlight. Love can be powerful. Love can also be overwhelming, and sometimes the most courageous thing a person can do is admit that something beautiful also hurt. Sally Field didn't dismantle a legend. She completed a narrative, and in doing so she reminded everyone that real love stories are rarely tidy. They are layered. They are imperfect, and sometimes they end not in reconciliation, but in understanding. In the end, Sally Field didn't expose a scandal. She exposed complexity. Her words about Burt Reynolds weren't designed to shock. They were designed to be honest, and honesty, especially about someone the world adored, is rarely comfortable. For decades their relationship lived in photographs and film clips, playful interviews, undeniable chemistry, a kind of Hollywood magic that audiences still romanticize. But real love doesn't live in freeze frames. It lives in private moments, in power dynamics, in choices made when no one is watching. Sally didn't deny that she had loved him. She didn't deny that he mattered. What she denied was the fairy tale. She acknowledged the emotional weight, the imbalance, the parts of herself she lost trying to hold on to something that wasn't healthy in the long run. And when she said she couldn't be around him at the end, it wasn't bitterness. It was boundaries. That's what makes this story serious. Not scandal, not accusation, but growth. Burt Reynolds later called her the love of his life. That regret sits heavy in hindsight, but regret doesn't rewrite history, and reconciliation doesn't erase pain. Sometimes two people can love each other deeply and still not be good for each other. sometimes closure doesn't look like a reunion. It looks like distance. Sally Field didn't tear down a legend. She simply reclaimed her own narrative, one that includes love, hurt, strength, and survival, and perhaps that's the real truth behind their story. The most powerful love stories aren't always the happiest ones. They're the ones that teach you who you are, even if you have to walk away to remember it. If this reflection moved you, share your thoughts in the comments below. What do you make of Sally Field's quiet honesty about Burt Reynolds? And if you want more stories that look beyond the Hollywood gloss, hit subscribe and turn on notifications that will keep telling the real versions. Music fades.